download the show on your whole phone, tablet, or your brain, your iPhone too.
Convo Cafe, suckers.
Welcome to the Combo Cafe. I'm your host, Vaughn. And on the show today, I'm very excited to have a very special guest with me. She received her PhD from the University of Southern California. She is a postdoctoral scholar at the Carolina Population Center at the University of North Carolina. She is a recipient of the Core Fulbright U.S. Scholar Award, and she has also served as a contributor to CNN in America, the Associated Press, NBC Washington, and Al Jazeera America, but she is most frequently asked to contribute to the Washington Post. Most recently, she wrote a book entitled The Love Jones Cohort that examines the mental and physical health, wealth, residential choices, and dating practices of an emerging Black middle class that is single and living alone, more commonly referred to as SALA. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Kris Marsh.
Vaughn, thank you so much for having me. It's such a pleasure to be on the podcast with you.
Thank you so much. It is truly a pleasure for me to have you today. And congratulations on the recent release of your book, The Love Jones Cohort. I would like to say, as a married man with kids, I found this book very delightful to read, even though I'm the opposite of everybody that was in the study.
Right. And here's what's so interesting about the book is that you don't have to be single, you don't have to be Black, you don't have to be middle class to enjoy the book and get something out of the book. I remember I was in the airport and I was talking to a married man about the book, and he was like, oh, well, I don't have to get that book because I'm married. And I was like, with the attitude like that, you may not be married long. Right. And the reason why I say that is because we've all held the title of single at some point in time. If you're no longer in the category, I think the book can help you understand the relationships that you're currently in, and it can help you navigate your single friends and how to think about the way in which you talk to them and certain questions you ask them. So the book really is for everyone.
Yeah, I agree. I think, it's funny because it really dawned on me when I was reading the book that some of my single friends actually struggle with being single. But the struggle I thought they had was with trying to find people that, that they wanted to be with. But I didn't realize that some people just struggle with other people having a problem with them actually being single.
Right. That is so true. It's like people, for some reason, we've been conditioned from a very young age that we're supposed to be partnered or married. And I want to say on record right out the gate, I am not anti-marriage and I'm not anti-men. People think simply because I'm talking about singlehood, I'm talking about, oh, Black women don't need a Black man. That's not what I'm saying at all. But what I am saying is that we've been conditioned from a very young age to think that we have to be married or partnered. And people are so emphatic about not wanting to hold the title of single that they're willing to be in relationships that are oppressive, toxic, abusive, and unfulfilling simply because they don't want to hold the title of single. So I'm trying to destigmatize the single title and get more people to think about what single actually means and celebrate their single life. I think if you're happy and whole in your singleness, then that's a place where you can start to think about romantic relationships. But until you embrace your singleness, I think it's short-sighted to think that being married is going to solve all of your social ills and social issues. And that's not how this conversation is going. It really is just trying to highlight singlehood and what singlehood means.
Right. Agreed. So let me ask then, out of all of the people that were interviewed for the cohort, was the general consensus on getting married that some of them are open to the ideal, or were most of them just not even considering it at all?
So I can't remember the numbers, but I interviewed 63 people total, I believe. And some were just like, yeah, I'm good. I'm really excited with what I'm doing with my friends and family, that marriage is not necessarily high on my priority list. But there were some that were like, I really do want to be married. But regardless of whether they were like emphatic about not wanting to be married or open to the idea, nobody was willing to settle.
Right.
They were like, I'm not going to take any kind of a relationship. It's got to be a relationship that's going to be beneficial for us. That's going to be positive. It's going to be uplifting. I'm not going to just marry or partner someone simply because I don't want to have this title. And what was also really, really interesting, I noticed a gender difference because I did decide that I wanted to interview both men and women in the book. women dominate the category, but there are some men that are single and living alone. So I didn't want to lose their voice. So I included men in the story. And some of the women in the cohort were suggesting that they were hopeful that they might get married one day. And for the men, it was just a matter of time before they decided to marry someone.
Right.
So I thought that was a really interesting gender dynamic. And I wonder what that, as a scholar, I still grapple with what that really means. So I don't know if the men are suggesting that they're going to find the lesser of two evils, quote unquote, or if they're being very thoughtful in the decisions that they do make. But men were much more emphatic about, it was a foregone conclusion that they were going to get married. But women were hopeful, but they were hopeful that it was a positive, uplifting, really inspiring kind of relationship if they did get married.
Right. I don't know. I think me myself, I thought about the guy that was in the book, and I don't want to give his name, I guess. I don't know. Is it okay if we give people's name in the book?
Yeah, they're pseudonyms. They're not their actual names.
Okay, all right. So there was a guy, I guess his pseudonym was Kevin, and a thing that he said is that women wanted a man who like exerted a certain level of providerness, or so to speak. Do you think that might be the shift why men just figured that there would be a time maybe when they were going to marry because they already assumed that they would be the provider, whereas on a woman's side, she probably wants to get a mate, but she's not probably looking to get into a relationship where she would necessarily look to be as a provider or the person who would necessarily provide the lifestyle?
Yeah. And you know what? That's a really great question. And you're in Michigan. And I think, if we think about like middle class, right. You think about like the Black middle class in Michigan, you think about, is it Ford or GM that's in Michigan? Please don't quote me on the one that's in Michigan. Is it Ford?
All three.
Oh, God. Okay. Well, all three. Yep. So here's what we know. Before, like, you had a nice, thriving Black middle class in Michigan, right, because you had people that would work, let's say, at the Ford plant for years.
Absolutely.
And then they'd have really great pensions. They live in these really nice little Black middle class neighborhoods. Mm-hmm. But the labor market has changed in a lot of ways. And right, marriage is no longer a necessity for middle class status.
Right.
And you have this economic freedom among women in particular. And because you have this economic freedom, I think women have more context to help them decide who they're going to marry and if they're going to get married. Because my mother's generation or my grandmother's generation, marriage was like the way in which you were able to acquire middle class status. But now you have so many Black women that are middle class and aren't married. And so marriage looks a little different, and the utility of marriage looks a little different. Now, right, there might be some listeners that are saying, well, what about love, and how does love play into that entire conversation? And I think that's a really great question. But I also think when you can't disconnect love necessarily from the economics, and all of those are decision markers that you put into the basket when you're deciding who to partner with. And right, if you have more economic freedom, that may in some ways disrupt the traditional kind of understanding, like you just marry somebody simply for love.
Right. I agree with you. But it's funny, and everybody laughs at me because I always refer to Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And trust me, I'm not that deep of a person, but I just remember Maslow's hierarchy of needs for some reason. And it's like, who can really think about love until we know what we're going to eat and where we're going to live at next month?
Amen.
You know what I mean?
Amen, church. Amen, church. But I think also in that, and I think it also resonates in the book, we spend so much time, like I said, in a very young age being conditioned, like we have to be partnered and married, and that's what we have to do. And so because we are conditioned that way, we think about marriage in a certain kind of way. But in the book, the cohort really talked about how they have these non-romantic, nurturing relationships. Right. And I think in a lot of ways, what happens is that people put all of their eggs in the marriage basket and being married, and they don't cultivate these non-romantic, nurturing relationships. Translation, friends. We have friends. So when people come to me and say, woe is me, I want to be in a relationship, I'm like, I push back and say, well, what kind of a relationship do you want to be in? Because we are all in relationships.
Right.
So if you say you want to be in a romantic relationship, I'm like, well, why? Why do you want to be in a romantic relationship? I think it's a very simple question, but I think it's a very critical question that people should ask themselves. Like, why do I want to be in a romantic relationship? Is it simply because I've been conditioned from a very young age to think that that's what I want?
Right.
Or is it more than that? It's a simple question, but it's a question that we all should ask ourselves.
Right. I agree. So, I mean, do you think that being solid will become the dominant household in the black middle class?
I'm not sure. Married couples with or without children are still the dominant category. I do know that the solids, the single and living alone, is the second largest household type in the black middle class. And if trends continue, the demographic trends continue the way in which the data is suggesting, yes, they can at some point cross over and be the dominant category in the black middle class. Yeah. So I think that that's an interesting conversation. But what is also more interesting for me, and the implication maybe, which I think is interesting, is what does that mean if the largest household or even the second largest household in the black middle class are single and living alone? And that's part of the reason that why I wrote the book, because I really wanted to think about the implications.
Right.
So if you think about like how we transfer class status in the social science literature, class status is typically transferred from parent to child or from partner to partner. Right. So if the second largest household type in the black middle class are single and living alone, the question becomes, how is the black middle class going to reproduce itself?
Right.
And that becomes a really interesting question. And I try to tease that out in the book. And one of the things that the cohort members talked about for me is how they have to think about, as their homeowners, as their business owners, as they own precious metals and gold, they have to think about who they're going to transfer their wealth to, especially if they don't get partnered and they do not have children. And the cohort have innovative ways.
Not to cut you off. I'm sorry, not to cut you off, but you get into my favorite chapter, chapter 7.
Okay, is that chapter 7? Okay.
I think that's chapter 7, isn't it? Is it a generational immobility?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
And I was going, let's put that on the back burner for a second, because I want to talk about that as a specific conversation.
Combo Cafe.
Ashy the classy, sexy and sassy. Okay. Oh, you smell so good when you walk right past. Yes, Lord. You wanna love somebody, you better love your body. Facial and hair care products for you to rub your body. Cause this is social light. Body essentials, y'all. Promote and smell good skin with no pimples, y'all. Put on your makeup, sundresses, and eat your toes right. Wrap your body, butter and rub. You want some social light. Social light body essentials, body care, natural deodorant, facial care, hair care, herbs, and luxury fragrances. To order, go to sociallightbodyessentials.com. Do you think the ideal of picking the wrong life partner threatens the middle class status of members in the cohort, but more particularly women?
I think in the choosing the wrong life partner and choosing for the wrong reasons and choosing out of social pressures is horrible for the person. Now, I'm not even thinking about the black middle class at this point, but I think it can be damaging to the person, the individual. And so I think that people should make really wise decisions as who they decide to partner with. So I'm looking at the individual first, but I also do think that it could have implications for the black middle class as well. And so it's really important that when we think about who we're going to partner, we're really thoughtful in that exercise and that conversation, and have these really tough conversations with ourselves about what really is important to us when we're just choosing life partners. But yeah, I think it could be damaging to the individual, and it definitely could be damaging to the larger black middle class community.
And I know you're talking about, I know with that last comment, you said that you weren't just even talking about just, black people, but just people in general. But do you think that being black and middle class is different, than being middle class in another ethnic group?
Absolutely.
How so?
Absolutely, because even though the data is really clear on this, I think some of this is in chapter 10. Even though you're black and middle class does not mean that you have arrived. In fact, when we think about this from the health perspective, health disparities actually the differences in better health outcomes tend to be higher, or a bigger gap, when you're more educated than less educated. And so just being if we're using middle education as a middle class marker. So just because you're educated, just because you have money does not buy you out of your Blackness. I think the day-to-day microaggressions that you have to deal with, or the racism or the anti-Black sentiments that run through some of these social institutions may look different, but just because you're middle class does not mean that you have arrived and you are no longer subjected to racism or gendered racism. It still exists even at the higher socioeconomic levels.
Yeah, I agree. I consider myself